He had not seen another soul in years, not since the world had slipped away from him like sand through open fingers, not since the cruel and unrelenting sun seemed permanently fixed above a barren horizon so vast it could swallow hope whole. Caleb Hartwell's footsteps echoed against rock and dust, a sound so familiar that it felt like memory, like something that belonged to another man. The days, at first, had blurred into one another, sunrise, toil, nightfall, stars, and before long the rhythm had become indistinguishable, the silence so complete that Caleb felt it thrumming through his veins, shaping his thoughts into something as unyielding as the desert wind. He had stopped counting the years somewhere around year 3, when counting seemed as pointless as trying to measure eternity. What had begun as solitude had become his quiet guardian, what had begun as loneliness had hardened into a shield he raised against all pain. He woke each morning to the same austere landscape, jagged mesas bathed in gold, cacti standing like solitary sentinels, a sky that burned in impossible blues and reds, and he went about the day's work with mechanical precision. He tended the small garden he had coaxed from the dirt, he patched the cracks in his weathered cabin, and he scanned the far horizon in vain for any sign of life. At first, the emptiness had felt like punishment, a sentence handed down by a world that had forgotten him, but as the years stretched on, the silence became less suffocating and more like armor, protective and familiar. The wind knew his name, the rattlesnakes kept to shadows, the jackrabbits watched with cautious curiosity. Caleb's only companion, a dust-gray dog who had wandered into his life months after the last traveler vanished, lay curled near the wooden door, dreaming of running through fields that existed only in memory. Caleb reached down each day to scratch its ears, grateful for the simple warmth that reminded him he was still alive. Still human, despite the harshness of his life and the relentlessness of drought and heat, he had fixed up his cabin into a place of retreat, walls built from scavenged timber, a roof of corrugated iron, a hearthstone placed with care, and the solitude had taught him lessons no school ever could: how to read the wind, how to conserve every drop of water, how to find laughter in a whispered breeze at dusk. He learned how to listen to the silence until it spoke. And yet, deep within that stillness, Caleb sometimes felt a restlessness he could not name, a tug at the corners of his weary heart, a reminder that life needed more than survival. Until that fateful morning, when the horizon shimmered like a promise, unusual in the stark world he knew so well. It was just before midday, when the sun was still rising toward its zenith and the desert heat did not yet claw at your throat. Caleb noticed two figures moving across the distant ridge, tall, deliberate, and unlike the mirages that sometimes danced on the horizon. At first, he thought the heat had finally started to play tricks on him, sending illusions to taunt his isolation. But as they drew closer, limping silhouettes against the stark blue, he saw that they were real, and they were struggling. They appeared to be women, yet not fragile like the travelers of old he had once known. These figures were tall, towering almost like giants in Caleb's eyes, their steps heavy, their clothing tattered, and their skin sun-darkened like leather polished by years under the sun. Caleb dropped his watering can and instinctively reached for the rifle above his mantle, his muscles taut with fear and caution. His dog, sensing something unusual, rose and growled low in its throat, watching the newcomers with alert eyes. But Caleb did not raise his weapon because something in their staggered walk and weary posture told him this was not threat, it was desperation. One of the figures stumbled and nearly fell, clutching her side, eyes shaded against the relentless glare. Then the second spoke, their voices ragged, not loud, but carrying across the wind like whispers begging for mercy. They called out for water, simple, elemental, life, and something deep in Caleb's chest tightened at the sound. Water, the one thing his valley offered only sparingly, the one thing he guarded like a secret treasure. He watched them sink to their knees in the sand, exhausted beyond measure, their strength faltering with every heartbeat. The first words they uttered were not threats, not demands, but pleas. For water. Caleb hesitated, mind racing between instinct and compassion. The water in his canteen was barely enough for his own needs, and yet he felt a tremor in his soul, a reminder of all those years spent alone, days when a greeting from a passerby, a smile, even a shared meal would have meant the world. He remembered who he used to be, a man of community, of laughter and shared stories by the firelight, of morning coffee with neighbors. All those things seemed distant now, like tales from another lifetime. But now, looking at these two figures, staggering under the weight of exhaustion and thirst, he felt that old longing resurface, stabbing through his isolation. With a heavy breath, he lifted his eyes toward his garden well, grabbed the canteen, and took the first step toward them, not knowing if this choice would be his undoing or the beginning of something greater. And as his dog bounded ahead toward the strangers, tail wagging despite the harsh heat, Caleb felt a spark, fragile yet undeniable, ripple across his chest, awakening something he had buried long ago. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, yet none of them could say exactly when the cabin stopped feeling like a shelter and began feeling like a home. The desert no longer sounded empty to Caleb. It spoke in layers now, in the rhythmic strike of tools against stone, in the sisters' low voices exchanging plans at dawn, in the soft laughter that drifted into the evening air when the heat finally loosened its grip. The older sister, Ayanna, carried herself with a quiet authority that came from surviving too much too young, her gaze sharp and steady as if always measuring the horizon for danger. The younger, Nayeli, was fire and wind, her movements quick, her curiosity endless, her smile capable of cutting through even the heaviest silence. Together, they filled spaces Caleb had not realized were hollow inside him. He found himself waking before sunrise not out of habit, but anticipation, eager for the shared labor of the day and the simple miracle of conversation. They repaired the old fence line together, reinforcing it with techniques the sisters had learned from their people, methods that worked with the land instead of fighting it. Where Caleb once struggled alone to keep the soil alive, the sisters taught him how to listen to it, how to plant according to the moon, how to shade young crops with woven reeds, how to honor water by never wasting a drop. Slowly, impossibly, the garden grew fuller than it had ever been, green breaking through brown like hope insisting on being seen. At night, the fire became their gathering place, its glow painting their faces in gold and shadow as stories flowed freely. Caleb spoke of his past, the town that had dried up after the mines closed, the family he had buried one by one, the final moment when he chose the desert over grief because grief felt louder among people. He admitted, in a voice rough with honesty, that he had come here to disappear. The sisters listened without interruption, without judgment, their silence respectful and deep. When he finished, Ayanna nodded once and said that among her people, disappearing was sometimes the only way to survive, but staying hidden forever was another kind of death. Her words settled into Caleb's chest like embers, glowing quietly long after the fire burned low. In return, the sisters shared their own pain. The slow erosion of their village's water sources vanished, the choice to leave rather than watch their elders suffer, the fear of trusting strangers in a world that had given them every reason not to. Each confession braided their lives tighter together, until it felt as though fate itself had stitched them into the same story. One morning, long after the sisters had regained their strength, a sound rolled across the desert that Caleb had not heard in years, the distant clatter of hooves. The dog barked sharply, hackles raised, and Caleb's hand instinctively went to the rifle, but Ayanna placed a steadying palm on his arm. From the ridge emerged 3 riders, dust-covered and wary, eyes scanning the land as if expecting resistance from the very ground. Travelers, not soldiers, yet desperation clung to them the way thirst clings to the throat. The sisters stepped forward first, their posture open but alert, and spoke to the riders in a language Caleb did not know, though he understood the meaning well enough. Water was offered, shade was given, suspicion melted into gratitude. That night, as the travelers rested by the fire, Caleb realized something profound and unsettling. The desert had not just returned people to him, it had made him a keeper of passage, a guardian of survival. Word spread faster than he expected. Within weeks, more figures appeared on the horizon. Families, lone wanderers, broken men and determined women, all drawn by whispers of a place where water flowed and kindness was not a currency but a way of life. The cabin evolved again. A second structure rose nearby, then a third, simple shelters built with shared hands and shared purpose. The sisters became leaders without declaring themselves so, guiding newcomers, teaching them how to live with the land instead of bleeding it dry. Caleb watched in awe as Nayeli organized work crews with infectious energy, turning labor into laughter, while Ayanna settled disputes with calm wisdom that diffused anger before it could ignite. And in this growing settlement, Caleb found himself no longer defined by what he had lost, but by what he was helping to build. He no longer stood at the edge of the group, watching life pass by. He was in the center of it, his voice sought, his experience valued. The desert that had once been his refuge from pain became the ground on which healing took root. Yet life, as it always does, tested what they had built. One scorching summer, the rains failed entirely. The well dropped lower each day, the water line receding like a promise being slowly withdrawn. Fear crept in, subtle but sharp, and Caleb felt the old instincts return, the urge to retreat, to hoard, to survive alone. But the sisters would not allow it. They called the people together at dawn, speaking plainly about the danger ahead, about the need for discipline, sharing, and trust. Rations were set, work intensified, scouts were sent to search for new water sources, traveling farther than anyone had dared before. Caleb joined them, his body aching but his resolve unshakable. Days blurred into relentless heat and effort, hope flickering with every dry riverbed they crossed. And then, on the 7th day, they found it, a narrow canyon where water pooled in shadow, fed by an underground spring that had outlasted the drought. The discovery felt like a miracle carved from stone. When they returned with the news, the settlement erupted in cheers, tears, and prayers spoken in many tongues. That night, as the fire burned bright and the stars stretched endlessly overhead, Caleb understood something he had never known before. Survival was no longer his greatest achievement, community was. As seasons turned, children were born, laughter grew louder, and the desert itself seemed to soften around them, responding to the care it was finally given. Caleb grew older, his beard streaked with white, his hands rough and scarred, yet his eyes shone brighter than they ever had in his solitary years. He often sat on the ridge at sunset with the sisters, watching the land glow red and gold, reflecting on the strange mercy of fate. Had he not chosen kindness on that single day, had he turned away, guarded his water, protected only himself, none of this would exist. The thought humbled him every time. One evening, as the wind carried the scent of rain from far away, Ayanna spoke softly, saying that some people are meant to be bridges, not destinations, souls who bring others together so something greater can be born. Caleb felt tears trace lines down his weathered face as he realized that, without knowing it, he had finally become more than a man surviving the desert. He had become part of its story. And to you who are watching, listening, and feeling this journey unfold, remember this: even the loneliest paths can lead to purpose, and even the smallest act of compassion can reshape an entire world. If this story stirred something inside you, if it reminded you that hope can rise from the harshest places, then stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, become part of this growing family of storytellers and dreamers, and let these stories walk with you wherever life takes you. The next chapter is always waiting, and it begins the moment you choose to stay connected.